All
Yay for
right,
me.
so we've got Anthony is a three-time National Magazine and two-time GLAAD Award-winning author, film programmer, pop culture critic, and PhD living in Toronto. His work is in a myriad of genres, often incorporating queer themes, and spans comics, prose, journalism, and academic research. Peter is a writer, producer, and host for CBC Arts. He writes the LGBTQ column Queries and hosts and produces the talk series Here and Queer. He's also spearheaded the launch and production of a series Canada's a Drag, variety special Queer Pride Inside, and interactive project Super Queeros, and the 2010s, the decade Canadian artists stopped saying sorry. Collectively, these projects have won 4 Canadian Screen Awards, and we are so excited to have you both with us tonight. They are going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then they will take questions from the audience. So, everybody in the audience, I want to ask you to please use the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your Zoom there to submit questions instead of the chat. It makes it easier for us to manage them, and then your questions won't get buried. But if you don't like the chat and you do post something or don't like the Q&A and we see it in the chat, we will copy and paste it in there for you. So with that, Peter, take it away.
Well, thank you so much to the VPL for having us. And Anthony, I'm so excited to talk to you about this book, Dayspring, which is monumental. And if you haven't read it, I'll sort of echo what everyone said and go find it at your local indie bookstore. Congratulations! This is
Oh,
it must feel so incredible to finally have this out in the world.
it's weird. First of all, thank you, everyone. Thank you to the VPL for doing this. Thank you to Dylan and Greg, and thank you to you, Peter. Peter and I ended the worlds together a few years ago. I don't...
Yeah, we went to the movies a week before.
Yeah, we went to see a movie that was not very good, and then we went to the after party, and then we were like, "Well, see you later." And then the next day, they were like, "Lockdown, like, do not leave your house." And I sent you 6 months of sad pictures of my sunflower seeds growing, and wrote
Well,
this book.
well, I'm glad that at least half of that was incredibly productive, and now we all get to enjoy that.
Yes,
Not
thank
that I
you.
didn't
The
enjoy
sunflower
the
seeds are dead now, but
yeah.
it
Um,
does feel good. It's weird. It's I feel like Sauron making the ring. Like you take all your power and you like, ooh, there it is, and then now it's out in the world, and I feel weirdly diminished, and it does things that I didn't intend it to do, and circulates in places I didn't imagine. But it's fun. It's interesting to see it have a life that is not quite mine anymore and show up in places I didn't expect.
well, yeah, there's so many things I want to get into, but let's maybe start with sort of finding queerness in religion, which I feel like this book does a lot of. There's a really beautiful passage in the book that sort of observes how Noah's Ark is often the first biblical story that children are taught. It's certainly the first story that I was taught. But it also, gets into how the lions on Noah's Ark are often depicted, perhaps accidentally, as two men or two male lions.
For
Sorry,
sure.
sort of this idea of finding queerness in scripture is, central to the book as a whole. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your own relationship with religion and how it's changed over time, and
Ooh.
whether these moments of queerness and queer identification sort of were part of that relationship. Like, do you remember the first time you ever learned about the disciple who Jesus loved?
Oh, I mean, I have this very, I think familiar to many people out there in the world, but maybe is not the way culturally these things are depicted, where it's like we've kind of inherited this kind of strange, like Protestant way of sort of chopping religion from culture, um, which I don't think was my experience. Like culture and religion were so tangled up with each other growing up. So I think the first time I clocked that twink was in the Last Supper painting, like a knockoff of a knockoff of a knockoff of Da Vinci's Last Supper, made out of like fake like brass, hanging in my parents' dining room. And there's like Christ in the middle, and then next to him is this one beardless, particularly distressed disciple, who's very close to him physically, proximately. Um, and so like I've always been aware that there's this figure who's in this incredibly privileged position in the Gospels, who is sort of there when you know to look for him. He's there at these very privileged and exclusive moments, right? Like he's first, there's like a weird little foot race where he beats Peter to the tomb. He's there at the Transfiguration. Um, he's literally nestled in Jesus's bosom at the Last Supper. Like he whispers to him in the Gospel of John. So like I've always known and been very drawn to this sort of way that as much as the Christianity, I think many of us were sold growing up about like pro-family, pro-tradition, pro-conservatism, that at the heart of that, literally at the closest spot to Christ, is this relationship that resonates at an incredibly queer level, I think. And that became a way to read into the Gospels and into Christ, right? Like, what does it mean that this figure who we've been sold one way, in fact, clearly never has a family and clearly speaks in like very like almost hostile terms about family, right? Like a disciple will be like, I have a wife and kids. He's like, I don't care. And like, who is my mother and my brother? Like, whoever is here with me. So like, there is something very queer at the heart, at the matrix of Christianity. And that's what this book spends 1,000 different ways to sort of explore, I think.
Yeah, and I feel like, it's a really interesting read for perhaps queer readers who aren't that familiar with sort of religious texts. Like, I feel like it really makes a case for religion in a way that I really appreciate. It sort of at the heart of it is this intense entanglement with the teachings of Jesus, but disentangling sort of the ethics of the Gospels from religion as an institution. Like, it's like the book acknowledges that it's often tied to colonialism and oppressive hierarchies. But it sort of disentangles the teachings from that. And I feel like I gained a new appreciation for Jesus through this book.
I got a convert. Yes, put it on the scoreboard.
No, maybe not quite, but certainly more converted than I have been in a while. So why was it important for you to make this central to the book? And can you say a little bit more about finding the process of finding a voice for Jesus that speaks to, people like me or just readers in general?
I found like it was not, I found the process was almost the opposite of that. I didn't have to find his voice. I just had to scrape the barnacles off it. Like, a lot of this, when I was doing my PhD work, my supervisor always said, like, just read it. Like, just stop trying to like do the work of seeing what 6,000 dead dudes have footnoted to it and just see what it says. And I think that when you do that with the Gospels, there is a very clear, very radical, very socialist, very funny voice and that comes through for Christ in that. So a lot of the times, especially in the moments when the text is like just reproducing text that everybody knows, the Our Father or whatever, I just had to scrape that away and say, like, here's literally what it says. And I wanted to present it in a way that does that as well, that sort of removes all this apparatus that has been created for these texts. Like, oh, when he says a rich man is like a camel going through the eye of a needle, that's like a reference to a specific gate. It's like, that's not true, first of all. And second of all, like, when you encounter it in the text, it's very clear in context that he's talking about this like radically anti-capitalist message. So I didn't have to find him. I just had to like, it was like more of an undigging. It was like something archaeological about it more than anything else, I think.
And was there anyone you were writing this for specifically? Like, did you have an audience in mind in terms of their relationship to Jesus and religion?
I lied to myself throughout the composition that no one would ever read this, which
Well,
is
that's clearly
why,
not true.
yeah, which is, I mean, now it's like, oh God, everyone knows what a pervert I am. But, but I mean, I've done a lot of commercial work. I've worked with larger IPs, both known and unknown, and I did promise myself that at least here, at least once, I would write something that was entirely without compromise. So in one sense, the only audience this book was ever intended to have was my own kind of workbook. But on top of that, I wanted it to be a text that makes available, makes legible, and makes at hand the kind of queer history you're talking about, that I wanted it to recover not just what's in the Gospels, but for example, what's in the Hebrew Bible. So like the David and Jonathan story is here presented in a weird way, the only thing in the book that is presented linearly, simply so that you could access what that narrative actually is, which is that this one time the prince fell in love with this shepherd boy and it destabilized the whole kingdom, right? I wanted it to be an archive and an anthology of queer Christian literature and its erotics. So that also, if a person, I imagine there's a lot of people who don't like what I've done with this book, but I also wanted it to be, well, if you have a problem with me, you might have a problem with Teresa of Avila, and you might have a problem with John of the Cross. You might have a problem with Rupert of Deutz, who like they marry Jesus and they make out with Jesus, and they like Teresa of Avila gets penetrated over and over again by an angel with a shaft. Like there's a quote in the book from Simone Weil who said, you can't get mad at the mystics for using their body to understand God because it's the only technology they have to understand God. So that's what this book, that's the orbit around which this book is constructed, I think.
Yeah, and speaking sort of its construction, it really struck me sort of its complex handling of time. Like it's a nonlinear story that zigzags across history and different narratives. It seems to inhabit sort of multiple temporalities in the same moment. It's also a story about the long life of grief, and how it sort of distorts itself, to me at least, and in shifting
Right.
sort of shifts in sort of the sands of memory. How did this all begin for you? Like this whole sort of project, like how did the full scale of it unfold for you? And it's so impressive, and I'm just so curious, like how that was working in your mind in terms of thinking about doing it in all these ways.
Um, how did it unfold? It started, I knew I was going to be working on this at some point in my life, very young. They're very short, but there are sections of this that survive from when I was 16 years old.
Really?
Um, I've edited them as much as possible, but I did think it was important to keep a kernel of that in here. Um, Much of the book was written, as I said, at the very worst of the pandemic, sort of the most isolated moments of it. And it was sort of in those moments where I felt closest to this narrator, like the beloved disciple. He doesn't actually. The beloved disciple doesn't have a name in this text. Neither actually does Christ. Neither the name Jesus nor John appear in this. But that figure, the beloved disciple, then goes on in the Christian tradition to write the book of Revelations, which he does alone on an island as like an old graybeard man. He's the only disciple who doesn't get the joy of being martyred. He lives too long. Um, there was a story in early Christianity that like, well, Jesus will come back. And then when they were trying to figure out the timeline of when he'd come back, they were like, he loved that guy the most. So I bet he'll be back before that guy dies. And that turned into this narrative of this figure who maybe has never died, who is still sort of wandering the earth, waiting for Christ's return. And that sort of led me and excused me to start playing with the way this book plays with time. In the same way that I said, like, Christianity has always been interested in the erotic because it's a religion about the time God was a human being and had a body and like moved through the world and ate and pooped and got mad and yelled at things and needed a nap. It's also a religion that is interested because of that in the way God is now, the way that this moment is now. So like very often when you're like, you'll walk into a cathedral in Florence or Rome and it's like, there's Jesus and there's a scene from the Bible, but behind them is like contemporary Florence. Behind them is contemporary Rome. Or Pharaoh is dressed like a Renaissance king or something. So I felt a certain almost obligation to sort of let the text destabilize in time as it needed to and to understand itself in that way. I was pulling from when I was a kid, I was obsessed with The Last Unicorn, where it's like a fairy tale where like the guards read from magazines and have like bottle caps and stuff. Um, yeah, and sort of the derangedness of that experience of sort of living 2000. There's something about grief and memory to me that does that, that you look back and you remember the details wrong, but the feeling endures. And this is a character who's sort of stuck in that permanent ruin and aftermath. And so the details become unglued. They also very obviously, I'm afraid, become obvious memoir moments. So I just let them do what they wanted to do in that sense.
And living with these characters and living in this world, like during such a challenging time for all of us, and obviously, like you sort of spoke to that, you did a lot of this work during the pandemic. What was it like, sort of inhabiting this world during that time? And do you find it sort of helpful in sort of pushing you through it?
Yeah, I think I did. It's a book. It is a book very much set in that sort of permanent grayness that was the pandemic. There's descriptions of walking along the waterfront in this book that were literally my pandemic experience. I'm surprised the sunflower seeds I sent you did not make it into the book. And the way that it felt like the world had ended. I mean, this is a figure who was an apocalypticist who wrote The Great Apocalypse. Um, and the genre of apocalypse is sort of like, in a weird ways, obsessed with God, how I wish this would end so I could understand what it meant. Um, and there's a way that that's kind of, the pandemic was not an apocalypse. The pandemic was like a waiting for one. Like we were waiting for something that would make this make sense. And to me, that was the horror of it, just like feeling yourself and the world's meaning kind of erode out of it and wishing something would instantiate meaning into it. Um, I had also had a breakup right before the pandemic. So like this book is thinking about um the way it feels when it feels like the thing that made your life have meaning is now over. Um, and you are called to keep going, even though the thing that seemed to be the engine of your life has passed, which to me is what this disciple's feeling must have been, right? To sort of watch the love of your life, whatever you think that relationship was, to watch that, like the text tells us this is Jesus's most beloved disciple. If that thing that makes you matter, like in the Gospel of John, he doesn't have a name. That's all we know him by is the beloved. So once the thing that makes your life have meaning is gone, how do you endure? And I think that's a very pandemic kind of book, I think.
Yeah, very much so. I also just want to remind everyone that if you have a question, to put it in the Q&A box, because I think we'll be getting those in like a little under 20 minutes. Anyway, back to this. One of the book's really distinctive features is just how many different voices you put in it from the past. There's, the biblical narratives are reimagined, but there's almost an anthology throughout the book of poems and excerpts from a huge range of writers, from medieval mystics to Renaissance poets. Not to mention that sort of many quotations that get woven in through the voices of the narrator. Why was it important to you to include so many different voices from across such a range of time? Like, I'm just sort of curious in terms of what the thinking was behind including that sort of distinctive feature of the book.
I think part of it was to do the thing you just said, which is to make it an anthology. Part of it was to make it a workbook where it's like, well, look at this. Maybe there's something in John of the Cross that might interest you. Um, because I do think there is something, I talk about this in some of my other work. There is something permanently amnesiac about queer culture. That is partly structural and partly antagonistic of the culture. That is to say that, like, by simple dint of how queerness manifests in the world, we very often do not raise our own young, right? Queer people are sort of thrown like random seeds into the world and have to find their way to culture. And that often means, I think, that we are, and you know this better than anybody else in this country, we're bad historians of our own culture. We're bad at remembering who did the work, where the bodies are buried, so to speak. And the second half of that is that, like, obviously the culture wants us to forget. Like there's this kind of permanent, I watch it happen every day on like Twitter, where it's just like there were no trans people before 2012 or something like that, right? Like
Yeah.
or like I just saw it 2 days ago where someone was like, in the 90s, we didn't care if people were queer. And it's like, really? Like I was alive for that. And I remember what that was like. So you mentioned Noah's Ark. I did want this book to kind of function as an arc. I wanted it to be a record of like turn the corner in the Vatican and you'll see this work of art and here's the faggot who made it, right? Like I did want to claim a stake at the heart of Christianity, not just at its beginning, but throughout. Like, here's where Michelangelo is, and here's where Teresa of Avila is, and like, here's where Rupert of Deutz is, and here's where Mchthild of Magdeburg is, right? Like, so this like obsessive way the text is sort of gathering these is part of its project. But the other part of its project is I'm obsessed with T.S. Eliot, and there is a kind of like fragments gathered against ruin in this. There is a habit of my mind, both academically and in my writing, that is obsessed with itself being an archive and itself making reference and itself sort of turning these weird little pieces and thinking about them again. It's the work I do with Dumpster Raccoon Cinema, where it's just like, here's a piece of garbage. Like, let's think about why it's interesting, which is why the text is also constantly being like, here's a quote from Peter Pan, here's a quote from Shakespeare, here's a quote from Milton, here's a quote from the Smurfs, you know, like, as a consequence, I'm very often congratulated in this book for passages I did not write. Like there's a lot of quotation in it. One of its subtitles at the very beginning on page 1 is a work of great plagiarism, because I did want it to be an assemblage and a collage. And I think there is something of that is about like, I didn't write it, you know, like there is something about me wanting to be like, this is something that existed already. And I wanted to kind of have a way of absenting myself from it, but also showing a kind of parallax of it. Like, what if we turn this just a different way slightly? And that's both true of the relationship it depicts, but also the poetry and quotation it endlessly reproduces in itself.
Yeah, I mean, that also sort of really leads into sort of the form of the book, which is pretty sort of wild. And maybe this is an interesting question for anybody who's watching who you know wants to publish a book or wants to publish poetry. You know, not only is there sort of a massive scale of the book doesn't necessarily just have a massive scale. There's also really striking features like, you know, the red ink throughout it. This was a striking use of blank space, sometimes profound silence for multiple blank pages in sequence. It seems to me very deliberately and sort of meaningfully designed as a book. And I wondered what your approach to that was like, and if it was ever a struggle to get this book published exactly the way that you wanted it to be published, because it's pretty incredible.
It's
sort of
pretty, isn't
how
it? Like, it's a pretty book.
gorgeous. It's a very pretty book.
I got very fortunate in my publisher, which was Strange Light, which is a division of Penguin Random House, and my editor, Jordan Ginsberg, who works together on Strange Light and also does Hazlitt. This story began life on Hazlitt, which is an online literary magazine, where I had written the Bruce MacArthur piece I wrote during that trial,
Yeah.
which was just like a biopsy of the village that was just like, I was just so mad listening to the police chief lying on the news that I really hadn't written anything for public consumption. I had only done academic work before that. But I was working at Glad Day Bookshop at the time, and I was just like, I'm going to write for 2 weeks. I'm just going to write a biopsy of my thoughts and of the village. And I won't censor to myself what's in it. I won't think about why I feel like this is supposed to be in it. But it was just, again, like fragments gathered against a ruin. And I took it to Jordan. I was like, I got this, and God bless him, he published it. And then he was like, what do you want to do next? And this book emerged in its first form, really just 10 pages long for that. And they were very meticulous about letting me be very weird about the form, being both very exacting about it and also like bizarrely mercurial. He was like, what are the rules of the capitalization? I was like, it's mostly vibes, but when it's wrong, it's really wrong. They were so good about it. And you mentioned the red text. When I was a kid, we had a King James Bible in the front room of our house, and Christ's words are always rubricated, which just means red text, in that Bible. It's like it's a very Protestant way of being like, these are the important parts, which my mother does not, I think, care which edition of a Bible they're using anyway. So we had that, and it always has been with me. As a consequence, though, it did basically double the print costs of this book, and also meant that we couldn't. That physical limitation meant there were very few places that could print it, and then the content meant that there were very few places that could print it. We were very fortunate. I'm so pleased with the book. It even smells good. It has like a pine cedariness that I'm delighted by.
I agree.
um, the thing I was most delighted by about the way they respected its form was the audiobook, which to me is just like a feat. I really thought this book was not adaptable into the audio format. Um, and then Kathleen and Rachel did an amazing job. We stunt cast all the saints, like every queer Canadian is in this book. And then our narrator and Christ, we double voiced them. So because the book has no tags where it says like he said ever, like it's just the red font, we basically realized it had to be basically like a radio play. So it's got the two lovers just talking to each other, and it's a thing I thought was impossible turns out now to be, unfortunately, my favorite version of the book. So,
For those that don't know, can you talk about who is involved in the audiobook and sort of how that all,
sure.
in case I'm, yeah.
Pardon me. We at first we thought maybe I would be the narrator. There are people who can narrate their own books, but I also felt it was valuable for me to sort of introduce another level of fictive tissue to sort of separate myself one more time from the narrator. So we put out feelers. We heard so many auditions, and I was like carefully making notes as we went, and like, well, this guy's obviously straight, so no, and like, and then I heard Davin Babulal, who's our narrator, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then a few auditions later, I heard Landon Doak, who plays our Christ, and once I had heard those two voices, I was like, well, this has to be them. And it turned out that everyone they'd stacked the deck. They knew that I was going to pick those two. And then once we did that, I just put out feelers to my friends who are also writers. Kai Cheng Tom is in this as Mary Magdalene and as Julian of Norwich, particularly a saint I love, and I always think of Kai Cheng when I think of Julian. She also is God in the text. David Demchuk is in this. Carol Pope reads all of the David and Jonathan stuff. Amanda Cordner is in this. It really is like a who's who. And then we all went in. I do a few. I do moments where it's like, it's kind of useful to have like the authorial voice here. But we all went in and did Satan. So like, Satan speaks in this very strange, almost pantheon. It's very upsetting. When I heard it the first time, I was like, are you guys sure? This is a little too much, but I'm now obsessed with it. We were kind of inspired by, there's in the movie The Prince of Egypt, they asked me what it should sound like. And I was like, in Prince of Egypt, when God speaks to Moses, they now do it that it's Val Kilmer as Moses and Val Kilmer as God, which is cute. But as initially conceived, they intended it to be every actor in the movie was going to be God. And then it sounded to them too much like it was multiple beings. And I liked the idea of Satan sounding like a voice coming up from the culture to your mind. And then, of course, the Legion is in the text. And once we had that, it was clear what we had to do, and it's very weird.
Well, I've not listened to the audiobook yet, but I one tactic I actually started doing during the pandemic just to allow me to focus better on books was to listen to the audiobook while I physically read it. So it feels like the people are reading it to you. And I feel like based on everything I've heard about this audiobook and everything you've said, that would be a really incredible immersive experience
I know a lot of people are doing that. Yeah. My partner listened to some of it and he was like, I can't hear Christ without thinking of Landon anymore. Like, it's like, great. Okay, well, I wrote it, but big deal. Okay, fine.
So my last question before we get to the Q&A, people who read this, I'm sure are reminded of books like Anne Carson's autobiography of Red, or perhaps Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles. But some readers might also be reminded of a book that I think a lot of us know you've spent a lot of time thinking about, writing about, speaking about, which is Paradise Lost. And I'm just curious, for those that don't know, if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with that book and whether you learned anything from Milton in terms of how to take on a project like this.
Oh, sure. I mean, oh God, I've not had anyone do that to me. I've not had anyone be like, "Oh, you wrote an epic like Milton's." No. Uh, I did though. I not that I wrote it, but I did learn a lot from Milton. I worked on Milton for my PhD. I wrote a chapter of my diss, and then I did a year of my podcast is called The Devil's Party, where we just sort of read through Christian literature slowly and as a queer group of damaged Christian post-Christian readers. Milton, the reason I started that podcast is because I left academia and was very frustrated because I knew Paradise Lost and John Milton were such an interesting, very queer corpus of texts. But because of the like high barrier of entry for Milton, it was often read in like very conservative circles by very conservative professors, like who are like, oh, until you know Hebrew and until you know this text and this text and this text, you're not allowed to read Paradise Lost. And there's a dimension to which that's true. Like reading Paradise Lost is like makes Shakespeare feel like Mickey Mouse in a lot of ways. But when you know how to read it, it's a very queer text. And specifically, it's very like gendery. The angels in it are, Milton says, can both sexes perform or neither. The angels are kind of mad about the introduction of women because it kind of ruins this permanent gay gangbang that they're having in heaven. And Milton was also a very queer figure. His nickname in school was the Lady of Christ Church. He had a very feminine energy about himself. He had long, flowing hair at a moment where it was actually politically dicey for him to have it. Like his political party were called the Roundheads because they had such close cropped hair. And what I learned from Milton is not just how many passages I fully stole from him for this book, but also that there is a dynamic, alive, and very queer core to this text, to these texts, to this mythos, that if you're not afraid of it, and if you recognize it as your own and your own kind of, you're allowed to touch it, you're allowed to play with it, you're allowed to retell it. And then it can just it will just explode. It will just do things that you did not conceive it could do. And to me, that's the live wire Milton showed me how to touch. So sort of like, just make it yours. Don't be afraid of it. And it's something I've always tried to teach students. Like whenever it feels like they're scared of like a Shakespeare play or something, it's like, well, what does it say? Just read it. And it's a practice that has served me very well. And I learned it from that cranky old asshole 400 years ago.
Okay, so it's 20 to 11 or
Aw,
8, depending
okay.
on, I guess it's 20 to whatever, depending on where you are. And we have 11 questions from the audience, so I'm gonna get to them if that's okay with you, Anthony.
Yep. Okay, let's
Okay.
go. Are any of
Okay.
them mad?
I haven't even looked at any of them yet.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to be reading them for the first time as I read them out loud. So if anybody has
Okay.
put something in there to trip me up, I guess thanks. Okay, the
I
first
have
one is
not
from
yet had an angry message. I'm very excited for my first angry message. So if anyone wants to throw down, let me know.
Okay, so you're being encouraged. Please go for it now if you'd like. Jonathan Quinn from The Devil's Party asked, in what ways, besides fleshing out the relationship to the beloved, did you intend the Jesus of Dayspring to differ from the Jesuses, in brackets, Jesus, of the canonical Gospels? How do you feel about Dayspring's Jesus?
First of all, Jonathan Quinn is an amazing commenter on the podcast, has been invaluable in writing this book. So thank you so much. I was very specific, as I mentioned. The name Jesus does not occur in Dayspring, and the reason for that is because this is a story about Christ, and Christ is a very specific person in this text, but is also made of many people, because I think that one of the things this text is about, one of the things that obsesses the Johannine literature, the literature written around this disciple, the community of this disciple, John, is its obsession with love. He went to his grave saying over and over again, little children love one another. And when they asked him why that was, he said, because it is the whole of the gospel. So, and as the beloved disciple, there is a sense to that, which means that the Christ of this story is kind of made of all those instances of love in my life, all those moments that felt like I was touching something divine. And that means that, as much as I said at the beginning, like when we encounter the Gospels in this text, I really wanted to strip them down, just like take the veneer of the last 2,000 years off them and see what they said. It also meant that he had to be allowed to be very specific. He had to be allowed to feel like a real person, to feel like people I have known. There's a moment in the text where he has a parrot and then he doesn't have a parrot later. And it's because he's two different people in those moments from my own life. And he doesn't remember having the parrot, but he's also forgetful of love, which is, I think, also true of the Christian experience, particularly John's. So he is Christ, but he's not Jesus. And that was kind of important to me.
The next question is from Michael. The question is, I know this is an insane question, but it's been driving me crazy. Near the end of the book, when the Roman soldiers are nailing Jesus to the cross, one of them mentions
Triclavianism.
Yes, thank you so much for not. The text is also small in my somewhat of my defense, but that's not true. I wouldn't have gotten.
How dare you not know the word
huge.
Triclavianism? You're canceled, Peter.
I know.
Get out.
Sorry. Which I, Michael, Googled and found out was saying that Jesus was only nailed to the cross with 3 nails. I'm not Christian, and Google has been of no help. Every depiction I've seen has Jesus nailed to the cross with 3 nails, one in each hand and one through the feet. Where does the 4th nail go? Google has been no help at all.
Okay, yes, it is true. There is a sequence. The crucifixion scene in this book is quite, as many things are in this book, quite weird. The crucifixion in Dayspring is unusual in that it is not narrated by the beloved disciple, but is part of the beloved disciple's narrative. That almost never happens in the text, and it produced a kind of odd effect that we had to think about pretty hard for the audiobook, which is like, who is saying this? Because it's narrated in the text by one of the Roman soldiers doing the nailing. And I stole this from the York Mystery Cycle plays. The York Mystery plays are like the town of York in the medieval period would put on these pageants that tell the story of the crucifixion. And each section of the play would be put on by the guild in the town that was best suited to tell that. So the York Mystery Plays, the Crucifixion of Jesus is put on by the Pinners Guild, and the pinners are the people in this medieval town who are responsible for making nails. So they're extra qualified to tell a narrative about crucifixion. And in the York Mystery Plays, they are narrated by the Roman soldiers. Which has a really amazing effect when it's staged, because we can't see Jesus. He's lying on the floor, and these Roman soldiers are talking about the work of nailing him, and it produces this wonderful effect where you're sort of on their side, because they're like blue-collar workers trying to do something well, and it's only when the cross comes flying up and stabs into the mortise that you're like, holy shit, I was on the side of the Romans. It's a great effect. This is a long introduction to what Triclavianism is. Triclavianism is the heresy, and it is a heresy, that Jesus was nailed with 3 nails, one in a hand, and one through both feet. The church decided pretty early on that it should be 1, 1, 1, and 1. Each foot gets a nail. However, art has kind of decided the opposite is better. So like this cross, the cross of San Damiano, has 3. Most people are used to seeing Jesus with 3. But it's supposed to be, according to the Catholic Church, 4. 1, 1, 1, 1. Sorry.
No, I'm learning so much from this too. The next question is from Matthew Strang. When is the movie / movies coming out in talks yet? Desire to premiere a collab between Dumpster Raccoon and Queer Cinema Club screening.
Like a movie of Dayspring?
I guess that's what the question is, yes.
I feel like, I mean, when we talked about the sort of permanent nowness of this book, like Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell both do that, right? They're both sort of set in 60s, 70s, right? They're hippies putting on a play, and in Godspell's case, in downtown New York, very famously atop the World Trade Center when they talk about the temple being destroyed, right? And then in R.I.P. Norman Jewison, in Jesus Christ Superstar, in at that moment contemporary Israel, right? So like there is a kind of precedent for doing what this text does, of just sort of like wrenching things into the present day. And I used to think it was impossible to do as a movie, but then I thought it was impossible to do as an audiobook. So maybe it can be done. But it's only been out a week. I don't think anyone who has money to make a movie has read it yet.
Well, speaking of the audiobook, the next question is from Derek Austin. The question is,
hey.
I've been listening to the wonderful audiobook of Dayspring, and I admire your lyrical prose and, oh, sorry, the question keeps moving, and the ranginess of your references from art to theology and mysticism. As a fellow lover of the Baroque style and Milton and Paradise Lost, I'm wondering if and how poetry influenced your book.
Oh, well, everyone should go follow Derek Austin, first of all, and read all of Derek's stuff. The Baroque as an influence. We talked about how there's some Milton in this. There is perhaps an overrepresentation of 17th century content in this. John of the Cross is in this. Teresa of Avila is in this. Avila, for those of you who don't know who Teresa of Avila is, you know what she looks like because you've seen Bernini's statue of her where she's having like an orgasm and like her robe is like performing orgasmness. That's a very Baroque art. And that's what's kind of Baroque about this book, is it's about orgasms. It's about the moments where the sensual and the bodily sort of erupt past, surpass the reason, surpass like rationality, and finding God in that. I do think there's something specifically Baroque about Christianity. That is to say that if you believe one time God turned into a person and he was one specific person once, that's Baroque. That is literally that's what Baroque references. A Barocco is an irregular pearl. It's a pearl made because the grit that the oyster was using is irregular. And that's what a miracle is. It's just sort of like a thing that happens that erupts a pattern. And that's what this idea of the incarnation is. Like once upon a time, God showed up and like all of history sort of warps and deforms around it. So to me, that's what's Baroque about it, the sort of asymmetricality, the obsession with like lumpiness and obsession with like too muchness that this book is all about. That's a fun question. Thank you, Derek.
The next question is from Zach. Where do you see the future of Christianity in queer spaces and queerness in religious spaces, especially Catholic and Christian?
I don't know. In many ways, like the thing this book is not is a manifesto. Like the thing that I didn't accept in as much as it is Christ's manifesto, except in as much as it wants to reproduce his thinking. But I think it is about a what nowness. It is about like a gathering up of, it's sort of the image that recurs over and over again in this book is like standing in ruins, right? Like there's a lot of ruined churches in this book. Like there's Notre Dame and there's whatever the one is at the bottom of Edinburgh near Holyrood House, and like there's the melted church in Lisbon that was like destroyed by fire, San Domingo, and the reason for that to me is because that is kind of the queer Christian experience, is like, well, they melted the church I was hanging out in. Like, it's all just a ruin, and I'm standing near these beautiful pieces of something that don't quite add up to something that covers my head anymore. And I think that is kind of where we're at. I see a lot of Christian queer art, like Sufjan Stevens and Lil Nas and Kai Cheng Tom. Like, Even what's his name, David Archuleta, is writing these queer Mormon songs. A lot of us are just like, this thing happened to me and it's the only thing that my brain knows how to do, but you keep telling me I'm not allowed to have it. Like Lil Nas was like, you told me I was going to hell and I made a music video about going to hell and now you're mad. Why? I don't know what the future of it looks like, but what it feels like we're all doing is saying, like, actually, this is mine. Like, actually, I'm allowed to have this and I'm allowed to decide. And I think that's what's exciting about it. I think that's why so much art is about it right now, is because, like, we're all seeing in it a capacity for something that we've been denied. There is sort of a core that would let us do something real in the world. And we're using that vocabulary again because it feels like it's been denied us. But I don't know what's next, and I'm interested. I would sign a manifesto if someone wrote one.
The next question is from an anonymous attendee.
Oh, hi.
And the question is, I'm sorry, it's not mean like you wanted.
Oh, damn it.
When another textual arc is built in 1,000 years, is there a particular passage from Dayspring that you'd hope to see included?
Oh, like a Canticle for Leibowitz situation. Um, I mean, the thing that to me that has to be the piece of it that matters the most has to be the one that mattered the most to this disciple, which is that we have to love one another. There's a moment, and I don't want to spoil too much of the book, but spoilers for the Bible too, I guess. There's a moment towards the end where it's quoting one of the letters of John, and which is just like literally what it sounds like. It was just a missive sent off to another community, and it says it talks about how like he loved me, and if he could love me, then he loved everybody, and if that's true, that means that even when our own hearts condemn us, God is greater than our hearts, and so we must love one another. Like the idea that we know ourselves to be wicked. Like we know ourselves, and this is this is a permanent habit of my own mind, is sort of like this anxious sense of being not worth it and being garbage and being like the audio track that's just underneath the surface of my own brain that partly was installed by all these priests and nuns and churches that I went to. And the idea that God likes me more than I like me, and that means that I should reach out and find someone, the horizontality of Christianity, the loving one another. That's the part I hope endures of this when they dig it up out of the nuclear remains.
The next question is from Alex Koppel.
Oh, hey.
In your Patreon podcast, Devil's Party, you were doing a queer reading of Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained and the Gospels of Mark and John as you were working on Dayspring. Now the podcast is reading Revelations, and I'm curious if either of these questions interest you. Are there any ways Dayspring might have been different if the Devil's Party had done Revelations during the writing? And what's it like reading Revelations or any other text now that Dayspring has been completed?
It's a very fun question. Alex, Alex and I met through the podcast. Revelations has been an interesting experience. I was very hesitant to do it on the show, even though it was by far the most asked for text for what we would do next. Revelations is written very certainly not by the person who wrote the Gospels, and there's no scholar alive who would suggest that that's actually true. And slow reading it makes that all the more apparent. It is sort of it's a nasty, mean bit of work, which is very fun. And there's a lot of Revelations that is excised into Dayspring. I don't think had I read it with the podcast community, that too much of it would have made it into Dayspring because, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, I very rapidly realized that Revelations was going to form the backbone of my next book, that I wanted it to sort of, its nastiness and its meanness would serve a second project, which is kind of, as I'm now conceiving it, sort of the obverse of Dayspring, about the same thing, about the sort of way that God annihilates the self, but more about the horror of that experience. So that's what I think. That's what I think would have happened had I read it earlier. I still would have been like, I'm gonna save this for a minute.
The next question is from Jonathan, and they ask, what sources, experiences, etc., did you draw from for the characterization of the relationship between John and Mary?
Oh, there's two Marys. Mary Magdalene, I'm going to assume, I think.
That seems fair.
The Magdalene in this, I had to long think about the Magdalene, because she, in this text, is presented. I ultimately decided she had to look the way she looked in my childhood imagination. That is to say that she had to be what Gregory the Great basically made her to be, which is a collapse of the character who's called Mary Magdalene in the Gospels, who is a rich patroness of the disciples, and the adulterous woman who Christ stops from being stoned, which is not even really supposed to be in the Gospel of John. It's just this weird fragment that has made its way into the Gospel, and Mary of Bethany. And this is very technical for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, but Mary of Bethany is the version of Mary you see in like Jesus Christ Superstar, who like washes his feet and hair and like has perfume, who is also a wealthy character in that text. There's a lot of wealthy women in early Christianity because they were basically funding the movement, and they get immediately written out. And I wanted her to be a synthesis of that because I had already made the beloved disciple, a synthesis. He was already the Nianiskos, the young man in white, and John, and spoilers for later that I won't talk about in case there's people out there who haven't finished the book. He's many characters. And so when I had done that, I knew she had to be, as the text talks about, she had to be that woman, the many women I had met in my existence, and particularly as a queer person, who had found a way to make space for me when I felt at my most shy and at my most excluded. The women who did the work once the Hierophant of the church was done with me. In fact, the reason I wanted her to be voiced by Kai Cheng Tom is because a speech she gives in this book was something that Kai Cheng said to me word for word about 6 months into our relationship together. She talks about like, sweetie, we got to do something about your anxious attachment style. And that was word for word something Kai Cheng said to me. So when I hear her, I hear Kai Cheng, and now the world does too, actually.
The next question is from another anonymous attendee. And the question is, I'm a cishet atheist woman, but greatly enjoy Devil's Party and the short form Dayspring, and now the book. It's all eye-opening and teaching me about the ways others experience the world, and about contextualizing all these written works based on different backgrounds. And of course, your writing is so lovely and lyrical. How can I talk about your work without sounding like I'm appropriating someone else's culture?
Oh, first of all, it's a very sweet comment. Thank you for saying that. I don't think anybody owes Christianity anything. I don't think, it's funny hearing this question because, as generous and kind as its impetus is, there are people who would be mad at me for doing this text and say that I have appropriated Christianity, right? That like this was not my business to do. And like the sort of cri de coeur of this text is like, this is literally all I have, right? Like this is literally the only thing, the only cultural inheritance I was supposed to have. And then when I found out I was queer, you tried to take it from me. And so like the text is itself trying to recoup that. But it is only a sort of assemblage of fragments. There is no coherent culture for you to feel like you're appropriating here. It's notes towards a culture. Like I said, like it's pieces assembled in the hopes of a revelation to come. But you don't owe Christianity anything. It has been, for so as this text is partly about, like it has been allowed to be co-opted. Actually, Christ in the Gospels that is replicated here twice in the text, gives an answer to this, which is his disciples are constantly trying to stop people from preaching in his name. Like they're constantly like they like tackle a guy in a pond who's like trying to baptize people. Like, you're not Christian, you're not allowed to say you're Christian. And Christ says, anyone who says they're Christian, anyone who finds something in this has come in my name, and I have flocks you know not of. There's a weird way that, again, like the last 2000 years have seen Christian communities turn this into the exact opposite, that like you have to go through Christ to find truth. And in fact, I think what he says is like much closer to what he's meaning is like, whenever you find truth, there's a piece of me in that, and you're allowed to find it anywhere. So like Christianity itself in the gospel says there's no way to like appropriate it. You can just have anything of it that's useful to you. So, by all means.
The next question is from Brandon Medley. The question is, I'm only about a quarter of the way through the book, but one thing that has stood out to me is that you've managed to simultaneously portray your Christ with a very high Christology,
Sure.
while also making him very human. How did you approach writing each end of that spectrum? And what was your favorite parts to include? I love seeing the prologue to the Gospel for John, but also seeing Jesus reading comics and farting.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very kind of you. So the question of like the Christology of this text, it is Johannine in its intention, which means that it is as high as Christology gets in the gospel. For those of you who are atheists, for Peter, if you don't know this, like there's like the four gospels each have a different idea of like how high up the chain Jesus is, right? He's just kind of like a miraculous dude, or he's the son of God in some way, or he's like part of this like eventually outside the gospels a Trinity. Not really found in the gospels, although the Johannine comma is in this text for those of you who care what that is. But anyway, I wanted this text to be as high as the Johannine text is. That is to say that Christ is coterminous with the Father in this, etc., etc. He is God made flesh, which is not the intention of all the Gospels, but is the intention of this one. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? But he's human. He has to be human. And one of the subtitles of this book is against the heretic Cerinthus. Cerinthus was this guy who believed like, well, God was here, but he was kind of like a hologram. He was kind of just like, he didn't have to eat. He pretended to eat. He didn't really die. He pretended to die. And a lot of people believe that one of the purposes of the Gospel of John was to rebut this, was to say, no, he was human. He really lived. He really ate with us. And that obviously would be of great importance to the person who nuzzled with him at the Last Supper, right? So it was important that he poops in this, and he eats in this, and he takes grumpy naps. And that is the point, that Christ is God in this, but he's also this smelly little dude wandering around Nazareth. That was important to me.
Next question is from Ali. Do you have a recommended list of Bible sections and or other recommended reading for anyone coming to this book with less Christian knowledge?
Oh, there is a part of me that kind of like wonders if we should like annotate this someday. Like the 10-year anniversary will be like, here's the passage in the gospel that this is from. The texts outside the gospel are flagged. So like if you're like, oh, that's like an interesting person, like Julian of Norwich is a great place to start. Julian of Norwich should be a saint, but she's not allowed to be a saint because she believes hell is empty. And she's great company to read with. The Gospel of John is an amazing text. I loved reading it for the podcast. I think it's a wonderful company. I think that when you read it without hearing the 2000 years of silliness that has come since atop it, you encounter something that is quite often very moving and very beautiful in it. But yeah, and Paradise Lost. I love Paradise Lost. It reads amazingly. Sometimes when you don't even know what it's talking about, just read it out loud and it's like, I don't know what it says, but it sounds fucking awesome. And like that's a great place to start for sure. I love that book. I could read if I had only one book for the rest of my life, it would be Paradise Lost.
Another question from a anonymous attendee. Is there an external reference, piece of plagiarism that you've, or that you're especially pleased about having been able to work into Dayspring in terms of placement or any other criterion?
Oh, I did work pretty hard to make sure that nothing was in copyright. That was important to me. Um, is there a favorite moment? There's an extended sequence in it. Um, there's an extended sequence in Dayspring where the narrator is having like a particularly bad breakdown. Um, and the breakdown is manifesting as this sort of like glut of reference. It's just full of these moments where he suddenly is quoting Peter Pan and quoting Henry IV Part 2 and quoting Logan's Run and he quotes Rebecca, the moment when Mrs. Danvers destroys herself. And it was meant to be this sort of like explosion of like searching for meaning anywhere. It has a franticness that was very important to me. And it's the moment I think about for that particularly. The passage, I think, though, um, the passage I've tried reading when I do readings lately is I think it's page 91. Um, it's the passage that begins, "Of course it rained in Eden," and it's a rewriting of an image from Paradise Lost. Milton imagines that when Adam and Eve are evacuated from Eden, when they're pushed out by the cherub with the flaming sword, it's sort of like this thermonuclear event where he like is heating the sky behind them. And Eden, the physical space of Eden, is lifted out of the ground into the atmosphere, and it's dropped from above and sunk into the sea. It becomes this creepy island. And I just stole all of Milton's images and just reworked them there in that page 91 one. I think that's right now it's my favorite, I think.
Okay, we have a couple left. I think, are we over time, or are we okay to keep going? Well, I'll just keep going
I'm
until someone
okay.
tells
You
me
can
not to.
keep
Okay,
going.
cool. A question from Anthony, fellow Portuguese queer here.
Oh, hey.
I'm wondering to what extent your experience of Catholic texts through the Portuguese language in your youth inspire the images of Dayspring. Often language can include subtle shifts in tone. Did you infuse any of these cultural attachments as you wrote?
Yes, for sure. Also, hola. Yes. In fact, there's a joke very early on, where Christ is telling a story that my mother used well, my dad and my mom used to tell me, which is it turns out, a very Portuguese story, which is the story of why donkeys have long ears. Um, which is that like at in the manger, the cow blows hot air, but the donkey blows cold air. And Christ pulls on his ears. And Christ says in Dayspring, it might be funnier in Portuguese. There's a lot of those kind of moments. One of them, my favorite one, is there's a story that is really only in Portugal and Catalan, about and I don't know how to pronounce it because my Portuguese is terrible. The caganer, the shitting dude at the birth of Jesus. Um, there's a story there, and you'll see him in nativity scenes of a shepherd who was there when Jesus was born, but who had really bad diarrhea that night, and he's pooping himself in the corner of nativity scenes in Portugal, and it's become like this thing you have to have it in your nativity scene, your precept, as Portuguese people call them. Um, and he's great because he's like a reminder again that like even in moments of extreme sublimity, you got to eat, you got to poop, you got to sleep, right? There is something intensely Christian about this guy who really got to go.
We have a question again from Alex Koppel. I'm a little afraid that it's going to make it seem like I didn't learn a thing that I should have learned earlier, which is the question is going back to triclavianism. Say it again. Sorry, Anthony.
Triclavianism.
Triclavianism.
It just means three nails. A clavius is a nail, and tri means three. Triclavianism.
I did know what it meant now, but I didn't. I feel like maybe repronounce it again now. I couldn't do it. But the question is, why does it matter to the level of heresy how many nails were used? Or was it just the church feeling a need to have an answer and not being able to say it either doesn't know or doesn't matter?
That's an interesting question. It matters. It matters for a very specific commercial reason, which is that like people had relics of the true nails, and you had to have four. So if you claimed that there were only three, then why does this church have four, right? And then it matters for like poetic and theological reasons when you talk about like the five wounds of Christ and stuff, right? Like he's pierced here, 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 and in his side, five, right? So like passion fruits, they're called passion fruits because they have the five wounds, like, right? Like, that's why it matters. So that's it.
Oh, we have two more that were just added. One is from Darren Carr.
Oh, hey,
Not,
Darren.
not necessarily a reference to the book, but you've often said that Jesus loves pranks. What is your favorite of Jesus's pranks?
Oh, my favorite is the last one. He loves a disguise moment. He does like a very like he'd be great on like the Carbonado effect, like the TikTok stuff. Like, he loves disguises. He lies at one point to his brothers in the Gospel of John and says, "I'm not going to the temple," and then he puts on a disguise. He pranks the guys on the road to Emmaus, where he's like, "Surprise, it's me." But the meanest and funniest is the one he pulls on Mary Magdalene, because it has costumes that you can see in art. So Mary Magdalene is the first person who gets to the tomb, asterisk, as you'll see in Dayspring. But Mary gets to the tomb and she sees it's empty, and the gardener, a man she thinks is the gardener, is like, "What's wrong, Mary? Why are you so sad?" It's Jesus, and he's in disguise as a gardener. And you see this in art. If you Google Jesus gardener, you'll see he's often depicted. His like artists are like, "What does it mean that she doesn't recognize him?" So he has to be in disguise. So he's very often in like a gardening hat, like a floppy hat, and like he's like mostly naked because you have to see his wounds. So it's like this guy covered in wounds, like disguised as a gardener. That's the stupidest prank, and it's my favorite.
Okay, anonymous attendee says they have a very important last question, and I agree, and I think this is a perfect note to end this. The
Okay.
question is the Jesus of Dayspring a twink?
No, he isn't, because he's an otter. He's very hairy guy. Hair comes up a lot. I did grow up with the Bernini cross hanging in my church when I was a kid. I'm very used to that depiction of Christ, but he is not what he looks like in this book. How he looks kind of morphs around because, again, he's multiple people in this book in some strange ways. But a person who goes into Dayspring trying to encounter a twink will encounter the textual blockage of just how hairy that dude is. Sorry.
Brandon Medley just added, but is John the Baptist a bear?
Oh, John the Baptist. He could be a bear. Yeah, that the text will allow a bear for sure. I'm sort of obsessed with John the Baptist. He appears many times. There's several selections from the Book of the Mandeans, which is the people who believe actually John the Baptist was the Messiah. Definitely, he definitely was not shaving. He was definitely a hairy, full hair on John, big beard for sure. Yeah. And he's older than Jesus because he's his cousin sometimes. So he's an older, rougher dude. He's more of the Tim Tales kind of character in this for sure.
Well, these are our thoughts for us to consider as we go into the night. But I just want to thank, first of all, the Vancouver Public Library for setting this up, and Anthony for not only just writing this book, but taking some time for all of us tonight. So thanks so much.
Oh, this was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And yes, thank you so much to you, Peter. That was amazing. And to Greg and Dylan, that was amazing too. I'm very grateful for this chance to talk about triclavianism and otters and stuff. So thank you.
Yes, thank you both so much for being with us tonight. This has been so amazing. And thank you everybody from all over this beautiful continent, it seems, who's joined us tonight. I will have my coworker turn my slides back on if you would. Thank you, Greg. I just wanted to promo a couple of other amazing upcoming queer events